Okay, I started to get a migraine back there from the computer screen and all the lights that are around me. So now we have on the orange glasses to reduce computer glare. This is probably going to be my last one for the night because obviously my eyes, or at least, are getting tired. So in the last video we were looking at the looking glass self. And so now we're going to start to talk about self schemas and self categorization. And I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly because it's not a psychology class. I just kind of want you to get the point behind what's being said. So, we have another lens through which we can understand ourselves, viewing it as an organized system of different knowledge structures that influence the way we process information and how we behave because of the information we process. There's two prominent theories in this vein, and they are Mark's self-schema theory and Turner's self-categorization theory. Okay, so self-schema therapy was developed by Hazel Marcus, and she felt that self-concept is composed of different schemas. Schemas are beliefs or cognitive generalizations you have about yourself, derived from past experiences. And your different schemas are different specific domains. So you have a schema for how independent you are. You have a schema for how smart you think you are. You have a schema for whether you think you're an introvert or an extrovert, athleticism. So these are things that she felt are stored in long-term memory. And if you've seen Inside Out 1 and 2, you know what goes into long-term memory are the little blue spheres. Or wait, no, the little gold ones. So our self-schemas function as organized knowledge structures in long-term memory. So if you remember the movie Inside Out, you know that there were a bunch of islands when Riley was a little baby, and they were like Mommy Daddy Island, Toy Island, Imagination Island, and then pretty much the entire plot, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it yet, of Inside Out 2 is that some of those islands fall off into the sea and her friend island becomes more important, and her athleticism island, right? And her independence island. She wants to have a lot more independence than her parents are comfortable with, which is the natural way things happen. So, your schemas guide your behavior. So, this goes back to some of the things that you might hear out in the wild, like just, you're watching TV or something, manifesting something into existence. There's a reason why people believe that works, and it's because what you believe about yourself really does control a lot of your behavior. If you solidly believe you suck at math, you're never really going to give yourself a chance to be good at math. So the things that you fundamentally believe about yourself can be very influential, which is why we spend a whole unit talking about how we speak to ourselves. Self-categorization theory, on the other hand, was created by John Turner as an extension of social identity theory, and it focused on the nature of self-perception and how it depends on what context you're in. So he thought you had three levels. You had your interpersonal level, which is your personal identity. You have an intergroup level, which is your social identity, and a subordinate level, which is sort of like what you share in common with every human on earth. So when you go to a comedy show, a lot of the things that are said are super funny. And they're funny because they're relatable. And they're relatable because they're a common experience, like losing your keys and finding them in some really weird space, right? Like that's happened to almost everybody at least once in their life, getting really frustrated in a very long line. These are things that are just very common to human experience. So self-categorization becomes active, or in this case, salient, in a given situation because of this dynamic sort of interplay. They play off of each other between the perceiver's readiness to use a category and the degree to which the category or the scheme, or yeah, category, he's in categories. I was about to say schema and I stopped myself. And the degree to which the category fits the social reality. So, in other words, if I go out thinking I am a supermodel and I'm actually a chunky old lady, well, I may believe that going out the door, but that notion will be sort of corrected by the society around me. And so that's where that interplay is. It's sort of like you believe it about yourself, you sort of take it out into the wild, and then how people react to that, it has quite a lot to do with whether you keep that category or not. So when we're talking about philosophical conceptions of self-consciousness, that's how consciousness, vibration, what are some other words philosophy uses? Self-knowledge, all of these are the sort of concepts that philosophy uses when talking about knowing yourself. And so it runs very parallel to a lot of the psychological theories we have examined. For example, Rene Descartes famously placed self-awareness with contigo ergo sum, meaning I think, therefore I am in Latin. So he asserted the immediate certainty of your own thinking existence. Conversely, an empiricist like David Hume questioned the existence of a unified, self-discoverable through introspection self. He claimed to find only a stream of perceptions of his. He really did not feel like the I think has to accompany every representation. For example, what about I feel? So then you get into self-consciousness, and philosophically, self-consciousness is not just being aware of yourself, but being aware of yourself as a self, understanding you have a self. This might be the first conversation you've had with someone about having a self, having a dialogue in your head, having these types of ideas in your sphere of influence. So, of course, you've been aware of the fact that you're an I, you're a me, you're a that's mine, and that me is different than you. But actually conceptualizing and thinking deeply about the self is different than just understanding that you are a human being. In philosophy, self-knowledge usually refers to your particular mental state. In other words, what are your beliefs, desires, intentions, sensations, which is usually different from knowledge about your persisting self, which is the self over time. So when you meet someone, and you're interested in them, or you're dating them, or you're becoming friends, you tell all of your stories, right? And you don't just tell the stories about who you are right now today. Usually you're going to wind up telling some stories about who you were in the past, where you come from. That is your own personal narrative. And we're going to talk later about personal branding. But when we're talking about your narrative, that's what we're talking about. What is the story of you that you've written? And let me tell you something. If you haven't written it, someone else is out there writing it for you, and you need to take the pencil back because you're the one who really knows. So, related to this is your sense of ownership of self. That's your agency. Your agency is your sense of ownership over yourself, and that you are the only one who should be making decisions for yourself, right? You feel that your thoughts, experiences, actions, and body parts are mine. They're mine. You don't get to make decisions about them, right? This sense is often considered a basic feature of experience, though it's hard to understand how it fits with self knowledge, but definitely, if you're allowing other people to write the story for you, you are denying yourself the agency you deserve. And then your narrative self, as I just said, is a philosophical construct, and that is you should be the main character of your story. No one else should be the main character in your story besides you. And you should be the author, and you should be writing it. And you should be the one making meaning out of your life. Because if you are not going to be your own biggest cheerleader, who else will? Like, there are enough people out there in the world who are waiting to smack an ambitious person down, right? So it's really important that you have you first. You have you, from the standpoint of you make yourself a priority. You have agency over yourself. So there are some unique characteristics of first person awareness. You have this self-conscious, a sense of, there are parts of yourself you don't know. We call that your unconscious, right? And a lot of these perspectives that I've just said to you highlight the limitations of going one way or the other, where only you decide who you are and where society decides where you belong. So, your sense of self is not static. You were a different person at one time when you were 3, 4, 5, 6, then you are at 20, then you are at 30, then you are at 40, 50, 60, 70. So your sense of self emerges in infancy and early childhood. You become aware of yourself. By the time you leave home, you should be fully differentiated from your parents, where you are your own self with your own sense of agency and your responsibility for yourself. Regardless of how your parents feel about whether you're doing a good job or not, you should be your own person. They no longer get a vote. I mean, they can give you advice, they can give you their experiences, but at the time that you leave home and you strike out on your own, if all has gone to plan, you are a fully formed human, and you have a very clear knowledge of where you end and another person begins, right? And so those are called boundaries, those things where it's like, I know where I end and someone else begins. If you did not win the lottery, then you probably got some sense of self. There's probably still some agency you need to grab for yourself. You may not be, in my terminology, fully cooked, I think is a word that we could use for it, where it's like your brownie's almost cooked, but when you stick the toothpick in, there's still a little bit that comes out on it. Yeah, and that also is going to be a spectrum. As much as the spectrum of healthy families is a spectrum, so are dysfunctional families. And the dysfunction isn't meant to shame anyone. The dysfunction, or using the word dysfunction, is really about the family didn't do the job it was supposed to do, or it missed a few steps, which is, if you've ever had a new job and you've trained for that new job, yeah, you're in training, but it's not until you start flying solo and figuring that stuff out yourself that you really know whether you were trained fully or not fully. So you may have some learning on the job to do about your sense of self, and that is perfectly okay. There's a big influence these days on attachment in psychology and in our general gestalt as a society. So, your relationship with your caregivers and how responsive they were to you. And, recently, if you're on TikTok, you've probably seen everybody celebrating the fact that James Dobson passed away because he very much had a harsh, break children's will method of disciplining children. And so there's a whole generation that feels like they didn't get the attachment they needed because of some of the principles that he lived by. That's probably something that's going to get sorted out in the wash for history. But let's assume for a moment that you didn't have perfect caregivers who had all the time in the world to stand around and respond to your every need. Let's assume maybe you had a working mom and maybe some of the caregivers were great and amazing and some of them were less great. Or let's assume possibly that your mom and dad were no longer together and that maybe a lot of the job fell to your mom and maybe too much of the job fell to your mom and maybe she wasn't able to respond to your every need. And or you can reverse that and say father who had to work, who had to get childcare, who had to do because it should be equal whether it is or not. So, if you had any of those circumstances or worse, you probably have some on the job learning to do about your sense of self because your attachment probably wasn't perfect. How do I know what attachment style I have? Healthy attachment is where you have a great sense of boundaries. You know exactly where you end and another person begins. And you're able to have this sense of self, really know yourself. Your parents were your secure base. It was great. And so life is probably pretty great. You were prepared to leave home. Now, if you had less than that, you could have one of two and or a combo. So either you have insecure attachment, and you'll know you have insecure attachment if your greatest fear is being alone and you fear abandonment. That is a really good hint that you have a more anxious type of attachment. If you're avoidant, you stuff all your feelings down really far and pretend you don't feel them. But actually, you probably feel them more than other people because feelings tend to fester. But whatever. Large displays of emotion aren't your thing, right? So then you have anxious avoidants who are both at various times. So that's like the Cliff Notes version because I'm not trying to teach you all of attachment theory, but this plays a dominant role in a lot of your relationships, especially close relationships. So, your self concept may also be played upon by your attachment style. Can you change your attachment style? There's a lot of argument about that. That's the only place I can leave that. It is possible, I think, with a lot of work. I also think maybe you don't have to. Maybe healthy attachment isn't really the goal. Healthy attachment is obviously the goal, but perfect attachment isn't, is what I meant to say. So maybe you don't have to be perfect about this. Maybe nobody has to be perfect about this. Maybe the reason we're all on earth together as humans is to help each other with this. Maybe when we're willing to be vulnerable and we're willing to open up and we're willing to have empathy for each other, maybe that connection is where we fix those things. So, I'm trying to go through a lot of this because I don't want us to. Can I just ignore all this and go on with my life? No. If you want to do that, you can try, but you're going to have things like huge midlife crises and I don't know who I am and winding up in bad relationships. And, life seems to really, really want us to believe the best about ourselves, and life seems to really, really push us towards each other, towards connecting with each other. And yet there's that thing of hurt people, right? And I just got through saying hardly any of us got the perfect home life. I mean, like your parents can only do as well as they were shown. There's a, like, maybe I can do, I'm going to be ambitious. Maybe I can do 30% better than my parents did for me. That still might not be healthy. I mean, it kind of depends on where you start and where you end. So just know that nobody got a manual when you were born that came with you in the little bassinet that said, here's how you raise a child, only do it this way. We're all just winging it based on experience and other things. It's what you're doing too. You're winging life. So hopefully we can all cut each other a little bit of a break. Okay, so when you are wounded, you've experienced trauma, grief, illness. There are a lot of things that shape your sense of self. So one of the things that I talk about with my kids is I have lupus, I have rheumatoid arthritis, I have another autoimmune disease that's a ton of fun that has to do with my blood getting stuck in the channels of my brain. So even if I meant to raise my children from the healthiest place possible, the fact that I have autoimmune diseases, that I'm sicker, that I'm frailer, that I need more rest, that I don't have the same strength other people have, I can't go everywhere in the world because my immune system goes a little crazy, all of that. Imagine growing up with a mother who had bouts of that. Now, your mother didn't mean to do that to you. I didn't go out and lick the ground and get lupus. Like, it's not like that kind of a disease. So it's not like I could have done better and I'm not doing better. But, just social situations can conspire and leave you in a place where you don't have what you needed. And let's assume you have 3 different children, and children are not born as little blank slates. Each one of them is a different personality, right? Well, what works for one child might not work for another child and might actually harm the third one. So let's assume for a moment that if you have trauma, if things happened, you may know that this is not true, and so go with that. But in general, most parents wish they did better, at least. Some do not. There is evil in the world, but most do. So if you have any history of trauma, that can really leave a scar on your sense of self. It can affect your beliefs about yourself. It can affect your beliefs about yourself in a way that is under the consciousness. It can cause you to develop intensely negative core beliefs about yourself. It can leave a feeling of worthlessness. You may notice that you feel fundamentally different than other people. You may feel helpless, and you may experience really intense shame and guilt. You may not know what your own voice in your head sounds like because you've had so many other voices coming at you so forcefully. You may have to spend a little time getting to know the sound of your own intuition and your own voice. So the things that people who grew up in a healthy house take for granted, things like being able to trust your intuition and feeling generally positive about yourself, are not necessarily true for survivors of trauma. So when I said things below the conscious level, somatically, which is what we call that, trauma can manifest in actual physical pain, an altered experience of your body, including chronic pain, feelings of being dead inside, dissociative experiences where you feel like you're outside of your body, and identity disturbances. I mean, obviously, the most extreme version of that would be dissociative identity disorder, where there are multiple personalities, is what it used to be called. So, those disorders are characterized by fundamental disruption in your consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, or behavior. Usually, personalities form as a way of coping with overwhelming trauma. And the dissociation is a fragmenting of the self. There's also dissociative amnesia, where you won't be able to recall information. And there's something called depersonalization or derealization, where you have consistent experiences where you feel detached from your mind, body, or self, right? A less extreme version of some of this is borderline personality disorder, which can happen because of trauma. You can go through grief and loss because of trauma, major illness, and visible differences, depending on what has happened. And your neuroplasticity may be affected in a rigid sense by trauma, although that is reversible given some time, because change is a constant state for the brain. So, ultimately, the way you speak to yourself, how you conceptualize yourself, how is created by how you speak to yourself, what you think of yourself. There also, given all the theories we just looked at, is a component of this that is built by how other people perceive you. And then you have how you speak to yourself on a consistent basis in your own internal monologue. It reinforces your beliefs, positive or negative, right? So harnessing your neuroplasticity, being able to change parts of your brain and things like that, you want to try secure, supportive relationships. That's that connection we were talking about when we watched that TED Talk to this day. And we talked about how it's through connection to each other, and there can be this healing in a group. So mindfulness and meditation is amazing at handling a lot of the effects of trauma. Learning, if you're in my class, you're obviously pro learning. Physical activity like yoga, mindful movement is another way to give your brain some flexibility, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy can be important. Speaking narrative therapy can be important. Mindfulness-based therapies, speaking with someone who is a mental health counselor, they can be invaluable. And the job of a mental health counselor is not to tell you what to do. It's just to listen to you, to validate you, and to be show you what a healthy relationship, a corrective experience would look like. So, the next time we meet, we're going to talk about vulnerability and self-compassion. And we're going to talk about how important they are to us, okay? And I'll see you then.